Hi, everybody. Today we're going to begin talking about the causes of the Civil War. This will be the first video in a series of lectures that chronicles the events between 1850 and 1860 that ripped the United States apart, resulting in the bloodiest war in American history. Over the course of the next 4 lectures, we are going to examine a number of causes for the Civil War, namely major economic differences between the North and South, arguments about states' rights, tensions arising over westward expansion, and a series of failed government compromises that only made matters worse. However, underlying everything was the issue of slavery. Yes, the Civil War was caused by slavery. What I hope to do is help you understand how tensions over slavery underlined the major conflicts of this period, starting with the Compromise of 1850. So, ever since the Missouri Compromise in 1820, the United States had tried to maintain the sectional balance between Southern slave states and Northern free states. However, Manifest Destiny and the addition of new lands from the Mexican-American War now threatened to bring the issue of slavery to the forefront of American politics. The Wilmot Proviso, which attempted to ban all slavery in the territories acquired from Mexico, was just the beginning of the tensions created by westward expansion. Though the Wilmot Proviso never passed, it drew battle lines in America between the North and South over the issue of slavery, battle lines that would eventually be fought in the Civil War, a little over 10 years later. In the presidential election of 1848, the first election after the Mexican-American War, both the Whigs and the Democrats sought to avoid the slavery issue. The Whigs nominated General Zachary Taylor, who was the hero of the Mexican-American War. Though he didn't take a firm stance on slavery in the Western territories, he was from Virginia and was himself a slave owner. Due to health concerns, President Polk did not run for a second term, and the Democratic Party nominated Lewis Cass. Now, Lewis Cass was the father of a doctrine called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty was the idea that people of the Western territories should decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery. For anti-slavery advocates in the North, neither Taylor nor Cass were very good options. Thus, a new political party was created to address the slavery issue, which came to be called the Free Soil Party. So the Free Soil Party embraced the Wilmot Proviso and argued that slavery should be banned in all Western territories. However, it is important to note that they did not go as far as abolitionists at the time, such as the Liberty Party, who wanted to abolish all slavery throughout the United States on primarily moral grounds. Shouting slogans such as free soil, free men, the Free Soilers wanted to contain slavery to the South so that free white workers in the West would not have to compete for jobs with slaves. In the election of 1848, Taylor eventually won the presidency. But the Free Soil Party's success in the North signaled an increase in sectionalism within American politics that would only continue to increase throughout the 1850s. So President Taylor would have been happy to leave the issue of slavery alone, but other events in 1848 made this impossible. Earlier that year at Sutter's Mill in California, gold was discovered on the American River. The discovery of gold touched off a massive migration to the West, known as the California Gold Rush. People all over the world were struck by gold fever, and tens of thousands of people traveled to California looking to strike it rich. Though most people never found their fortune, the huge migration forever changed the development of the American West. The large number of people who were flooding into the San Francisco area and the surrounding Sierra Nevada mountains put a huge strain on local government. As a result, there was a large increase in crime, including robbery, murder, and claim jumping. The people of California demanded an adequate system of government. A state government, if you will, in order to deal with the challenges of their overnight population boom. Thus, they created a constitution in 1849 and applied to Congress for statehood. So immediately, Southern politicians were alarmed by California's constitution because it excluded slavery. The entrance of California as a free state threatened to tip the delicate sectional balance in favor of the northern free states. Additionally, there were fears among some Southern politicians that it would set a precedent for free soil in the West. They were worried that other territories such as New Mexico and Utah, also part of the Mexican Cession, would ban slavery as well. A group of extreme pro-slavery Southern politicians known as fire eaters began to threaten leaving the United States over the issue of California. And it became clear that if the government did not act, the United States would be ripped apart. So Henry Clay, the great compromiser, who had earlier helped avert conflict with the Missouri Compromise and had also negotiated a deal to end the nullification crisis, now took center stage again. Working with Stephen Douglas, a young senator from Illinois, and with the support of Daniel Webster, Henry Clay helped craft a series of compromises that, taken together, became known as the Compromise of 1850. At first, there appeared to be a deadlock on whether or not these compromises would pass. But when President Zachary Taylor unexpectedly died in office, Millard Fillmore became the new president and proved to be much more open to this compromise. With his support, the Compromise of 1850 eventually did pass. So the Compromise of 1850 was designed to try and balance the needs of both the North and the South in regards to the dispute over California. And it really had four major components. So first, California was admitted to the United States as a free state, which satisfied the northern states. Second, to appease the South, a new stricter fugitive slave law was created. In 1850, there were about 1,000 runaway slaves each year who were finding refuge in the North. Many of these slaves were assisted by abolitionists in the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad was a network of volunteers and safe houses that existed to help guide runaway slaves out of the South and to their freedom. People who guided the slaves out of the South were known as conductors. And the most famous conductor in American history was a runaway slave from Maryland named Harriet Tubman. Tubman had made 19 separate trips into the South, risking her life each time. Over 300 slaves owed their freedom to her efforts as part of the Underground Railroad. It was the presence of the Underground Railroad and the efforts of these abolitionists, such as Harriet Tubman, that caused Southerners to demand a much stricter fugitive slave law as part of the Compromise of 1850. The new law, known as the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, imposed much harsher penalties on Northerners who helped aid escaped slaves, and it stipulated that all captured slaves were forbidden from testifying in court or being given a trial by jury before being returned to the South. Now, the third part of the Compromise of 1850 was the outlawing of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. This was a small victory for the North, but many would have liked to see the practice of slavery outlawed entirely. Southerners saw it as a victory, too, because they were able to prevent full emancipation of slaves in the nation's capital. Finally, the Compromise of 1850 settled a territorial dispute involving Texas. Texas had claimed a huge piece of land that today consists of part of New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas. This large area was separated from Texas by the federal government and became part of the newly organized New Mexico and Utah territories. These regions were given power to choose for themselves whether or not they would allow slavery, following Lewis Cass's concept of popular sovereignty. This was a minor victory for the South because slavery was not completely excluded from these areas. However, many people recognized that the territory separated from Texas would most likely become free in the future based on this idea of popular sovereignty and the will of the people living in those regions. As compensation for their loss, the Compromise of 1850 paid Texas $10 million. So ultimately, the Compromise of 1850 would end the talk of secession and improve relations between the North and South. But the peace was really short-lived. Elements of the compromise would further provoke sectionalist feelings within the United States moving forward. By far, the most controversial component of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Law. Immediately, the Underground Railroad stepped up its activity in trying to free slaves from the South. The Freedom Network helped slaves escape all the way up to Canada, where they were out of the reach of the Fugitive Slave Law and could not be returned to the South and into slavery. Northerners despised the Fugitive Slave Law, which compelled them to help enforce the system of slavery even within their free states. Many Northerners who had been moderate before the Fugitive Slave Law became passionate abolitionists. Northern states responded to the Fugitive Slave Law by creating personal liberty laws. These laws attempted to make it difficult to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law by requiring escaped slaves to have a jury trial and preventing state officials from assisting in the capture of runaway slaves. The Fugitive Slave Law pitted the North and South against one another for the rest of the decade. Northerners would become increasingly angry at the South and its attempts to force them to protect the institution of slavery. The South, for their part, would look on at the North's continued refusal to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law with suspicion and mistrust. These feelings would only grow in the 1850s and kind of lead us towards the Civil War. So You can see through the events of the Compromise of 1850 that the growing tensions between the North and South were being primarily driven by the issue of slavery. Historians have cited many reasons for the Civil War, and one of the common reasons for the Civil War, in addition to slavery, is often the idea of states' rights. That Southerners were afraid of the federal government and that the federal government was becoming too powerful, that most of the power should actually rest in the hands of the states. This was definitely an argument that was made by many Southerners at this time period, such as John C. Calhoun. And so here is kind of where I have a problem with that argument. Ultimately, the argument for states' rights was simply a constitutional way, at least in my opinion, of arguing for slavery. And the Compromise of 1850 proves this because many Southerners in the 1850s were willing to completely abandon this principle of states' rights if it meant protecting the institution of slavery. For example, the Fugitive Slave Law was one of the ultimate examples of a strong central government. The federal government was coming in and requiring northern states to enforce slavery, despite the fact that they opposed the institution itself and had banned it within their borders. Yet, very few Southerners protested the Fugitive Slave Law on the grounds of states' rights. In fact, it was some of the northern states, like Massachusetts, that had made this argument and took steps towards nullification by making it illegal to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, as you will see, it is slavery. And slavery is the most important cause of the Civil War, and it underlines almost all of the tensions that we're seeing during this time period. Yes, it takes different forms, but it is slavery that it is the root of the Civil War, which we can see in the Compromise of 1850, and we will see in subsequent lectures as well.